Okay, so now that we're recording, officially welcome to our monthly webinar. Last month, because of the BFRB Awareness Week, we had a whole series of events. So we didn't have a standalone webinar. And the last time when we had a webinar in September, the topic you selected was self-compassion and skin picking. Just 1 second before I continue, can you click the raise your hand button just to make sure that you can hear me? Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. Because my Zoom was just making some weird signs around my microphone icon. Anyway, what I was saying, yeah, you selected self-compassion and skin picking as a topic, and I realized after I saw the topic, I was kind of happy because I think it is an important topic to talk about. But then I was left confused how practical you want it to be, whether you actually want to learn how to meditate on compassion or self-compassion, or whether you're just interested in what that is, how to practice it, and where to go about learning it. So what I did was that I created a webinar that explains what self-compassion is. Let me go to the next slide where I've listed the topics as always. What it is, and then what are the benefits of including that as a part of your life? What are the enemies of compassion, which I know sounds very dramatic, but it's not that dramatic. It's in Buddhist psychology, this term enemy of something in terms of emotions is usually used to denote either emotions that are very similar but have dramatically different meaning or consequences, or emotions that are completely the opposite. So in terms of compassion here, either something that can pass for compassion but isn't really, or something that is the opposite of compassion. So we have to talk about that a little bit so that you fully understand the concept and so that you don't fall into this trap of applying it wrongly. We'll obviously talk about self-compassion and skin picking, specifically where in the process of picking it can help. And we'll talk about self-compassion and triggers. And then after this, we will have our Q&A, so you can type your questions as I go along, and I will be happy to answer them. You can also email me your questions later on. I will give you my email in the end. What I was saying is, so this is like an overview of what compassion is and what it isn't. We'll talk about different practices that you can utilize in everyday life or in meditation to cultivate self-compassion. But I don't have enough time in one webinar to actually go over all this and teach you how to meditate. I used to give a course that was like a whole month only on self-compassion. And in that time, then you have enough space to do all this. So if you actually want me to teach you how to practice the meditation, like just self-compassion meditation, I've listed this as one of the topics. And if you select it for next month, we can simply have the whole webinar where I will guide you through meditation, and then we can have a conversation about it later on. I think that would be quite useful, because leading people into meditation without being able to hear your feedback feels a little weird. And for our tech team, they have to set up the webinar differently if we're going to have an interactive one. So if you want a webinar where we will just meditate and learn how to do that and discuss the experience, I would be very happy to have that for you. So just vote for it. So yeah, that's as far as the content for this evening's webinar. And let me get started before I spend most of the time talking about what I will talk about. So first we'll talk about what compassion is, so that you understand the general term, and then we will go to self-compassion as a specific aspect of compassion overall. So the definition of compassion is a rather simple one. It's so simple that it's almost deceptive. Compassion is just a desire to alleviate suffering. So whenever you recognize that someone is suffering and you somehow want to help, that's compassion. Like that kind of inner drive to help someone who is in pain. So it involves essentially at least two components. It involves recognizing your own pain or someone else's pain, and then this impulse to open up towards that pain and help the person. The moment when compassion as a feeling translates into action, we can call it kindness in that case. So when I'm talking about compassion, I'm talking about a feeling or an approach to other people, to our experiences. But when we're talking about specific actions, then we talk about kindness. Just so that you know, when I use these two terms, they're not the same, because kindness is, in a sense, practical compassion. Like, it's all the things that you do to be compassionate. Kind of like with mindfulness, and not necessarily, I don't know, it just kind of played out that way, but it's not the only way that you can think about these things. Compassion came to us as a field of in psychology from Buddhist psychology, because Buddhism, if you can call it a religion, has an excellent and well-developed psychological system. A lot of it really easy to test scientifically as well, measurable and very precise. So a lot of these concepts are testable. So that's why a lot of the mindfulness research draws on Buddhism, and compassion is really no exception there. In Buddhism, compassion is considered to be a very important, elevated, I dare say sacred, but it sounds a little pompous when I say it, but a sacred state of mind. It's practiced as one of the four, what they say, boundless or heavenly qualities. Like, that is how important they are. And they're called Brahma Viharas. So compassion is one of the four. The others are loving kindness, which is similar to compassion, but not quite the same. Sympathetic joy. So it's happiness when other people are happy, essentially. And equanimity as the fourth one. And so these three, joy, loving kindness, and compassion, share quite a lot in common. And then they have equanimity to provide a certain balance. And we'll talk about this a little more. Because when you develop them, equanimity is usually developed last, as it kind of stabilizes all of these together. I think the combination of compassion and equanimity is really important. Otherwise, we lose our sense of boundaries. But as I said, more on that a little later. It's important to know that even though you may not feel like you can offer compassion to yourself, or overall you might not feel like you're a very compassionate person, compassion is our innate ability. So everyone can be compassionate. You can think of it as having a seed planted somewhere. And so for some people, it's still a seed. For others, it's like a small plant. For some other people, it's a ginormous tree, right? So, but everyone has it. It's almost, I guess it's fair to say, to an extent, that it's hardwired into us. In fact, some people who study compassion argue that it is an evolutionary trait and that it's extremely beneficial for human evolution. I don't usually like evolutionary psychology, and I think every chance I get, I usually point that out. But I think I still don't like it, but there are some insights that I find very useful. This one being one of them. We frequently, when we talk about evolution, we frequently, people who are not biologists, obviously, talk about those kind of silly ideas like the survival of the fittest and things like that. But that's not necessarily how evolution works. Humans are pack animals, right? For example, I use puppies here, even though puppies are kind of better off than babies are, because human newborns are basically defenseless. And without a pack, at least a family or more than that, to protect them, they basically have no chance of survival whatsoever. And compassion is something that will bind the pack together. It's something that tells us that we should not care only about ourselves, but also about everyone who is a part of our pack, right? And so the bigger the pack that we care about, the bigger our field of compassion, so to speak. So there are some researchers who make this claim that compassion has actually been a huge evolutionary aid for us, because otherwise we would have a much harder time surviving if we didn't want to alleviate each other's suffering. I guess there's even a pragmatic case to be made, which is you want everyone in your in your group to be well, and you want them to suffer as little as possible, because then they can participate in the group and contribute to the group. So by protecting each other, the group survives. And this is why compassion and not selfishness is actually what has helped us evolve and come to this point. And sadly, somehow we seem to have lost quite a lot of that along the way. But I think it's a really enticing idea, because it really turns upside down this notion that it's kind of selfishness that gets us to survive. Whereas in reality, it's connecting to each other and being present and being there for each other that helps us survive. This is the woman on the right is Sharon Salzberg. She's if you're kind of in mindfulness circles, you certainly know who she is. She's one of the most renowned meditation teachers in the West. And those 4 boundless qualities that I mentioned are kind of what she, I can't say specializes in, but what she teaches the most. In the end, I will give you several books that you can read with practical exercises, of course. And one of them is her book called Loving Kindness, The Revolutionary Art of Happiness. It's this book here. This is a pocket edition of the book. And I quite like this book. I actually have 2 editions of it. Like, this is a smaller edition and I have an older one. And this one's just completely destroyed because I do the exercises, and when I teach, I use a lot of examples from the book because it's excellent. So she is a terrific resource. And if you want to practice compassion, her guided meditations would be my recommendation to start with. Here's what she says in a book called The Handbook of Kindness. She says the following: compassion is a practice of inclining the mind and of an intention. So you kind of set your mind in a specific direction, and that means setting the intention, right? Rather than laying a veneer of idealism on top of reality, we want to see quite nakedly all the different things that we feel and want and do for what they actually are. So what she's saying here is that compassion is not at all this touchy feeling, like, I don't know, in the clouds feeling. It's a very down-to-earth feeling. In this book that I just showed you, she talks about compassion as including this necessity to open up towards someone else's pain, but being able to hold that pain. And you'll see when we talk about self-compassion, that means for us to open ourselves towards our own pain and suffering, and then being able to stay with that pain, not to run away from it. So not to try, sometimes my clients talk about trying to convert negative feelings into positive feelings. That is not at all what compassion is about. As she says here, it's seeing things for what they actually are. I will expand a little more about this because I can see how it can be confusing to some people. But what I wanted to emphasize here is, first of all, that it has nothing to do with idealism. So it's not about being perfect. It's not about achieving anything. It's not about feeling in any particular way. There is no such thing as perfect, compassionate state of mind, right? It's a way in which you train your mind to look at how things are. So we can talk about it on different levels of poetic word choices, but ultimately that's what it boils down to. It is a practice of inclining the mind. You set your intention to be aware of suffering, and then you're mindful of different ways in which you can alleviate that suffering. I think this is really important to mention, and I'm going to read you a quote from her book. Here's what she says about compassion. This is from the chapter, it's from this book. It's the chapter on compassion. I'll come back to this chapter because it's a really, really lovely chapter. She manages to give quite a lot of information, but told through very relatable stories. So here's what she says about this veneer of idealism that we put on top of reality sometimes. When we deny our experience, we're always moving away from something real to something fabricated. To live by this web of legend will always harm us. The truth may be difficult to open to, but it will never hurt us. So it will never hurt us. This doesn't mean that truth isn't painful, just that there is, in Buddhism, they will frequently talk about having that suffering that kind of comes with life, things that are just uncomfortable or difficult or sad. And then there's the suffering that we choose. Another way, I guess, to say is that pain is not optional, but suffering is. That's what she's talking about. So truth, as painful as it may be, won't really hurt us. So she continues, what a tremendous relief to have the actual truth openly spoken. There is suffering in this world. Everything is upfront. There are no games, no pretense, no denial. To acknowledge the truth of suffering allows us to feel our unity with others. So acknowledging other people's suffering brings us closer to them. In reverse, acknowledging your own suffering brings you closer to yourself, right? The goal of our spiritual practice, or in this case, our meditation practice, is to be able to understand, to be able to look without illusion at what is natural in this life, at what is actually happening for others and for ourselves. The willingness to see what is true is the first step in developing compassion. So that's why she says that first we have to reject this veneer of idealism. So we have to see things very clearly. And then she says the following, more difficult than acknowledging pain, however, is opening to it. This is the second step in developing compassion, opening to pain and establishing an appropriate relationship to it. In order to genuinely open to pain, we may have to do so a little bit at a time, which means that you don't have to rush, you don't have to force yourself. You kind of naturally practice it, and then the more you do it, the greater your capacity becomes. And she says, if your opening is forced or contrived, our sense of purpose may shatter. So that means that we have to get rid of this like idealized image of what reality or what we want reality to be or what we think it should be. And we have to open ourselves to suffering because that's a component of compassion. But we do that in a compassionate way, weirdly. So we do it step by step. This is why just recently, I don't remember, it was here or somewhere else, I was giving a talk that kind of touched on self-compassion, and a few people emailed me asking me if I can send them some recorded meditations, and then I did. And some of the feedback that I got was really interesting because in one of the meditations, you're supposed to visualize different people in your life. And so you have different categories of people. And one category in these types of meditations is always someone you have a difficult relationship with. And when I was guiding the meditation, in the recording, I explicitly say, like, if you've experienced a trauma, some kind of abuse, or if someone has inflicted great pain on you, don't start with that person. It's unnecessarily triggering and also exceedingly difficult to feel compassion to someone who has inflicted pain. Start with a relationship that maybe isn't the closest or the most functional relationship, but don't start with a traumatic relationship. And funny enough, no one seems to listen to that piece of instruction. And then I received this feedback that this person basically experienced some kind of abuse. Let's not go into details. And she immediately imagined her abuser. And then, of course, it was really very triggering. And she even felt upset that she was supposed to feel compassion towards such a person. And then she emailed me and she said, the first time when I was going through the meditation, it never even occurred to me that you said, don't go for the most difficult person. And then she ended the email by saying, I guess that's why I need to practice compassion, because I never take things step by step. I just plunge into it. And then even something as good as compassion isn't as good because you go too far too quickly. So you take it one step at a time. Think of it as a circle that keeps expanding. So that's what compassion is. Hopefully the concept is clear. If not, go ahead and type in your questions and I will be happy to clarify. So what is self-compassion then? It's like the simplest thing is to say that it's just compassion directed inward. And there's nothing wrong with that definition. It's our desire to alleviate our own suffering. The same way that compassion is something that we're born with, or maybe a better way to put it is to say the potential for compassion is something that we're born with. Self-compassion is then also a capacity or a potential for it that we were born with. And yet, many people will find it very difficult. They will find it easy to be compassionate to other people, but not to themselves. Especially if perfectionism is one word that you would use to describe yourself, you may have noticed that you have a completely separate set of standards by which you judge yourself, and then standards by which you judge others, or maybe you don't even judge others, but you do for yourself. It's the same capacity. It's just that it has been developed in one direction, but not in another direction, right? When this happens, this kind of asymmetry, it seems unfair and it's very difficult, but it's actually quite useful because it tells you that at least in one domain, your compassion is well developed. So you already have a powerful tool, and then all you need to do is slowly learn to turn it towards yourself. Whereas some people might not feel like they're very compassionate, and then they first kind of have to grow the capacity to include themselves and other people as well. But anyone can do it. The person here on the right is Christine Neff. She's a very famous researcher and a lecturer, and she talks about self-compassion. It's practically, I would say, her life's work. I will recommend one of her books as well that is quite good. In my opinion, not as good as the Sharon Salzberg's book, but Christine Neff's book is less focused on formal meditation practices and more on just sort of how to introduce self-compassion in everyday life. So depending on which way you're inclined, you can choose the direction you want to study this in, She talks about a very important distinction, which is a distinction between self-esteem and self-worth, and how that relates to self-compassion. So look at the second line here. It says, self-compassion does not depend on either social comparisons or one's sense of personal success. So that means that self-compassion actually, in a sense, equals healthy self-worth. When you the opposite of self-worth is self-esteem. Self-esteem is something that you have to earn. It's something that's based on achievement, something that is based on validation, something that is therefore deeply dependent on other people and circumstances in your life that you may not be in full control of. So people who rely on that usually tend to have problems with their self-esteem. Self-esteem is very rarely stable because people around you change, so the criteria for how you get validated also change. Whereas self-worth is just this idea that no matter how messed up you may be, you're worthy of love. And that is a form of self-compassion. So as long as you measure your self-worth against other people's, you're not being other people's achievements. Sorry, I finished that sentence in my head. You're not being very self-compassionate. It's only when you're able to feel okay even without any achievements. This is not to say that, so it says here that there are no preconditions for self-compassion. And that's what self-worth is about. It's about you simply appreciating yourself for existing, right? You just deserve it because you're alive. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be happy with everything that you are right now. It just means that you don't think that you deserve to suffer because you're imperfect, or because you're work in progress, or because you have a lot of healing to do. So that's what it means. And that's the crucial difference between self-worth and then self-esteem on the other hand. Just to repeat, the difference being that self-esteem is something that you have to earn. And so therefore you continuously have to try and deserve it over and over and over again. Whereas self-worth, once developed in a healthy way, is essentially unshakable. There's about like 7 of you raising your hands right now. So apparently I said something that was quite interesting. Just type in your thoughts, opinions, comments, questions, everything you have in the Q&A. I promise we'll get to all of them So if you think that you have to stop picking to deserve self-compassion, no. You deserve self-compassion just because you're alive. Everyone deserves it. That doesn't mean that anyone deserves to be spared the consequences of their actions, including ourselves. It just means that no one deserves to suffer more than they need to. That's self-compassion in a nutshell. This is this woman on the right here is Pema Chodron. She's also quite a famous teacher. I will not include, I like her books quite a lot, especially Things Fall Apart and Places That Scare Us. Those two books are really, really good. I will not include her book In the End because she's a Buddhist nun and all her books are very explicitly Buddhist. So she will refer to Buddhist concepts and talk, maybe not through a religious lens, but certainly through an explicitly Buddhist philosophical lens. And the books that I will give you in the end as references, if you want to learn more, stay more on the secular level. But she's every bit is worth a reading. She's an excellent teacher as well. As you can see in this area, there are quite a lot of teachers that I truly appreciate. Here's what she says. I sometimes have this little notepad where I write down quotes, and I wrote these two down, but I have no idea where I copied them from. I think from When Things Fall Apart, but don't hold me to it. So she says, self-compassion starts when we begin to befriend ourselves. And I agree with this statement, but I actually have a very interesting clinical snippet, like an example. I've had two clients in the past, one male, one female, who had very similar insights in different stages of therapy, but they were of the same type. They both had a lot of self-loathing. They were very hard on themselves for different reasons, obviously. But they both kind of realized that they treat their friends very well and that they tend to be very forgiving and very compassionate and very kind and very nice and very gentle with their friends. When their friends mess up something, they comfort them. When their friends need help, they get up and go and help them. But when they feel bad, they just end up yelling at themselves and being even more hurtful. And once they realize that there's this stark difference, it was actually the female client who started doing this, and then I suggested this to the male client as a technique. And she said, well, if I'm so good to my friends, maybe I'll just ask myself, if your friend was telling you this right now, what would your response be? I think it's a very simple question to ask. Let's say, for example, I don't know, let's say I wanted to read that passage from the book and I forgot the book, and then I started telling myself, oh, you know, how can you be that way? Like, you're ruining everything, you're not sticking to the plan, blah, blah, blah. Whereas I would never say that to a friend. And then a way to introduce self-compassion would be, if my friend had told me this, what would my response be? Would I tell my friend, you idiot, you ruin everything? I really never would. Probably not even as a joke. But I would tell my friend, you know, it's no big deal. I would tell my friend to be forgiving. I would tell my friend that it's okay to make a mistake sometimes. So if you ask this very simple question, what would I tell a friend? You can learn quite a lot about how to implement self-compassion. So when she says that it's about befriending ourselves, it quite literally works as a technique in everyday life. And then I tested this with the male client as well, and it worked very well for him. But it was quite interesting to see how this same notion of self-compassion translates differently among genders. It was quite a stark difference, let's put it that way. Here's another quote from Pema Chodron. She says, having compassion starts and ends with having compassion for all those unwanted parts of ourselves, all those imperfections that we don't even want to look at. Compassion isn't some kind of self-improvement project or ideal that we're trying to live up to. This is, I think, adding a little more to what Sharon Salzberg was talking about, only specifically here about self-compassion. And what she's saying here might be challenging, but it is a challenge worth undertaking, which is that those parts of you that you don't like are precisely the parts of you that deserve compassion. So that's where you aim with your compassion. Because the parts of us that we like and love, they're very easy to extend compassion to, or kindness, or whatever you want. But it's those moments when you pick, or when you feel guilty, or when you really fail at something, when you say something or do something inappropriate, like when all your shadowy parts come to the surface, that's where you need compassion the most. That's what self-compassion is. And this last part of the quote is, I think, really important. So I don't know, maybe tattoo this in a visible place. So it's not a self-improvement project. You don't become more compassionate so that you become perfect. You become more compassionate so that you don't suffer. You don't create this ideal of what you're supposed to be like one day when you develop enough compassion. Instead, you just extend compassion to yourself as you are now in the best way in which you can do that. So for example, self-compassion has been for years a part of my meditation practice. I will usually end, or sometimes even also begin, my meditation practice with some self-compassion phrases and compassion phrases in general. And there are some days when my whole body kind of reacts to this, when I can really feel compassion for myself or for someone else. And then there are days when I just say those words and they don't seem as intense. And then there are some days when they just seem to fall flat, like I feel nothing. But the point is not to feel a certain kind of a way. There is no specific way in which you're supposed to feel to say, I'm compassionate now. The way that you know that you're being compassionate is if you can look at all the dark sides of yourself and want to act constructively to ease their suffering. So that's what she's talking about. So it's not about being perfect. It's about kind of being okay in your own skin, whatever it is at this moment in time. Here are some benefits of practicing self-compassion that have been tested scientifically and shown to work well. We know that it prevents burnout, but we're talking about regular implementation of self-compassion in your life. It prevents compassion fatigue. If you're a therapist, a nurse, a doctor, a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, anyone who works with other people, and if your job is to be compassionate and kind, I'm sure you're familiar with the term compassion fatigue, especially after 2 years of a difficult pandemic. Self-compassion prevents that. However, be warned that self-compassion also means that you might decide that working less is something that's good for you. So it doesn't necessarily maintain your levels of productivity, and it doesn't necessarily maintain insane working hours. Developing self-compassion prevents burnout by learning how to say, okay, this was enough, or I can't handle this anymore, or this is too much for me. That's also an aspect of it. We know from research that it lowers anxiety and increases your resilience to stress. If you're struggling with skin picking and anxiety or stress are your triggers, and they are very common triggers, then cultivating self-compassion is going to reduce your triggers to begin with. I will show you specifically how self-compassion helps you heal from skin picking, like where it has its place. But just here you can see that a number of triggers will be reduced, right? They can't be entirely removed because stress is a part of life and so is anxiety, but self-compassion can significantly reduce anxiety and improve your resilience to stress. Improved resilience to stress means that stress will no longer be as triggering, and lower anxiety levels just means that you will have fewer triggers if anxiety is one of them. Furthermore, self-compassion is a direct antidote to perfectionism. So if you are a perfectionist, this is a practice to practice abundantly daily as much as you can. It improves sleep quality. I can attest to this, actually. This is one of the first things that I've noticed when I started practicing not just compassion meditation, but also loving kindness. I've noticed that I started sleeping much better, and I started having much better dream recall, and the quality of my dreams somehow changed. Even when they dealt with different topics, they were somehow easier, not as distressing, I guess. And then it reduces self-criticism. If you struggle with a lot of negative self-talk, self-compassion is one way to deal with this. So these are some things that we know from research, and to a large extent, thanks to Christine Neff that you've seen on one of the previous slides. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about enemies of compassion. As I said, it's not as dramatic as it seems. But for every one of those boundless qualities that I listed, equanimity, loving kindness, joy, compassion, there is a near enemy and a far enemy. I guess Buddhists think it's a kind of, I don't know, picturesque way of portraying it. So the far enemy of compassion is cruelty. For example, repeatedly hurting your skin may not be the first thing you think of as cruelty, but it is a micro-cruelty, if such a word exists. If not, I just invented it, so it exists. So that would be it. When you're being hard on yourself because you picked, that's also a form of cruelty, because you're not treating yourself in a compassionate way. Therefore, you're treating yourself with cruelty. You're being hard on yourself. This is relatively easy to identify. I don't think people need a guidebook to identify cruelty, or at least most people don't. However, the near enemies of compassion is what's really important to understand, because it will, I think, help you have a more precise definition of compassion, and it will help you not mistake compassion for behaviors that are actually quite harmful. So, strictly speaking, pity is the near enemy of compassion, meaning that this is a feeling that we frequently mistaken for compassion. Pitying someone is not a compassionate thing. It even has a dose of being condescending. Compassionate thing is to want to help someone, to feel the need to alleviate their suffering, right? So that's what it is. Complacency, or lowering the bar and setting very low expectations, in the context of picking, it could mean that sometimes people will give themselves permission to pick because they're stressed, and they will say it was a compassionate thing to do because I was really tired and very stressed, and picking is something that alleviates my stress. So it's about as compassionate as becoming an alcoholic to deal with social anxiety. So just to be clear, not very compassionate. But in the moment, it can feel like a compassionate act. Right, so setting our expectations very low can also appear to be a compassionate act because you're protecting yourself against invalidation. But actually what you're doing in the long run is causing yourself suffering because you're not pushing yourself even a little bit to get out of your comfort zone. So things are not so clear as I run away from every form of suffering, therefore I'm compassionate. We always have to think in short term and long term. Like those two tracks are always necessary. Reducing suffering short term, but maintaining it long term or even increasing it long term is not a compassionate thing. Right? So ideally, we can alleviate suffering short term and long term. But if we have to choose between long term and short term, the compassionate thing to do is long term, because we always look for sustainable change. We want to spare ourselves as much suffering as we can in the future, not just in the next 5 minutes. So whereas picking can sometimes feel like, fine, I will give myself the permission to de-stress like this, or what people often say, I deserve it. That is cruelty. Or at the very least, if we're being kind, it's lowering the bar. It's kind of being complacent. And it can be followed by pitying yourself And once again, that can be interpreted as compassion. Compassion is not, has nothing to do with pity whatsoever. And that's talking about towards others and ourselves. And it also, I have to say, I didn't add this, but I should have. It also has nothing to do with being overwhelmed with emotion. In fact, in this book that I just read a passage from, Sharon Salzberg talks about when she went to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I guess, I don't know, someone wanted to learn meditation there. And she was talking about compassion. And she kept getting the impression that the word was not being translated well into Russian. Let me see, if I scroll through the book, it's likely going to open on that page. 1 second. Elvis, it should be somewhere here. Because I've read this chapter so many times that by now here it is. Okay, so she kept having this this idea that somehow they're not translating it right. So she asked the translator, so how are you doing this? How are you translating? How are you explaining to people what compassion is? Now watch this explanation. So she says, when I say compassion, what do you say? And then the translator answers, oh, I describe a state of being terribly overcome by somebody's sorrow, like having a stake through your heart and having the burden of somebody's pain burdening you as well. I just sat there thinking, oh no. And I read this passage because I always find it very funny because of her oh no reaction, because this is how people sometimes seem to think of compassion. Like you have to be thoroughly overwhelmed by somebody else's feelings. I don't think you even need to feel what others are feeling to say that you're being compassionate. What you need to be is sensitive to other people's suffering and pain, right? So that was just the point that I just remembered I didn't make. So you don't need to be overcome or overwhelmed. Compassion, especially when coupled with joy and loving kindness, those 3 out of 4 boundless states, tends to play a bit with our boundaries. When you intentionally cultivate self-compassion, you're probably going to develop a better sense of where your boundaries are at work. When is it that you need to stop with something? When is it that you cannot give something to someone? You're more likely to recognize those situations where you simply have nothing to give, right? Instead of just desperately trying and failing and being frustrated in the interest of reducing your own suffering. But when we talk about practicing compassion towards everyone else, sometimes we risk blurring our boundaries and kind of exhausting ourselves for the sake of others, which is why we need, in what I mentioned in the beginning, equanimity, that state of being kind of stable and unmovable in the face of intense emotions. At the same time, you need a balance of compassion and self-compassion so that neither of these kind of becomes stronger. Because if all you think about is reducing your own suffering, you risk becoming maybe blind to suffering of others to a degree. Whereas if you're only focused on the suffering of others, you risk neglecting your own suffering and your own needs in relationships. So think about compassion and self-compassion as a constant interplay. Like it's always in dialogue within us. So how do you practice this thing that I've been talking about for half an hour? So here's what you do. Formally, you practice it through meditation. There are a number of meditations out there that are directed specifically at cultivating self-compassion. You have types of meditation practice that involve phrase repetition. So you have a phrase that kind of generates or entices the seed of self-compassion that we already have. Or you have visualization exercises where you visualize certain people and then offer compassion to them. In fact, I think this would be maybe a good place to mention this. Buddhists actually don't even talk about meditating in the way in which we do in the West. From what I understand, there really isn't even a word that means meditation. Instead, Because meditation has this, in Latin at least, where it comes from, it has this connotation of thinking somehow. But especially in Southeastern Asia, in the kind of Theravada Buddhism, they use a phrase that's called bhavana, and bhavana means cultivating, and not cultivating again in some mystical, airy, new agey way. It really simply means in an agricultural way, like you plant a seed and then you water the seed so the plant would grow. So that's what they do. So when they practice self-compassion meditation, they would say the word bhavana, not meditation. So what they do is they cultivate it. By repeating certain phrases, it's almost like you're priming your mind to direct its thoughts in a specific way. So you're not convincing yourself, I'm compassionate, I'm compassionate. It's more like, may I do this, or may I feel like this, or may I be more aware of this? For example, the phrase that I use for my own self-compassion practice is, may I be freed from suffering. So notice that it doesn't say I'm free from suffering, because sometimes I'm really not free from suffering. And sometimes even when I sit and meditate for a long period of time, I'm not free from suffering because my back hurts if I sit for 2 hours. So in that sense, when I say, may I be free from suffering, I'm kind of framing an intention there. I'm giving myself a framework through which I can filter my experiences. If you remember in the beginning, when I quoted Sharon Salzberg, she was talking about inclining the mind. That's what we do through meditation. But that's not the only way to practice self-compassion. This is one way. It's a way that is my preferred way, but it's by no means the only way. You can practice it informally in many different ways. For example, with small acts of kindness towards yourself, by introducing some kind of compassionate self-talk, meaning that you learn how to enter into compassionate dialogue with your harsh negative self-talk. You can develop a compassionate relationship to your kind of ongoing experience. You have a difficult thought or a difficult feeling, and then you learn how to develop a compassionate relationship towards it. I will mention the RAIN technique in just a few minutes. That would be one of the ways in which you can do it. And then also by assessing everyday activities through the lens of suffering. And this sounds, just now as I'm reading it, I realize that it doesn't sound very well. I don't mean that you should kind of measure up suffering, but when you're making decisions for yourself, there's a very simple question that you can ask. I can either go left or right at this crossroads in my life. Which one is going to bring me less suffering long term? It's very simple. And you can do that for every decision. One way to do, if you're very indecisive, for example, because I've seen this trigger picking in a lot of my clients, and you can't make up your mind about something simple as, I don't know, buying toothpaste, for example, and then you have like 2 kinds and you can't make up your mind. You can simply ask yourself, is this suffering that this indecision is generating worth the outcome? Ultimately, toothpaste A or toothpaste B, the only important thing is that you actually use it, because whatever toothpaste you get, your teeth will be cleaned. So in that sense, just introducing this, like, is this suffering worth the outcome? It gives you an approximation of what you should do. Sometimes it tells you choose at random, doesn't matter. Sometimes it tells you, no, this is the way to go, not this other way. But you can include these little things. It's a simple question. You can write it down, put it like on a sticky note on your phone, or like I don't know if you have this, but I have this ability to have a little message on my screen, and I will rotate sometimes like things that I'm working on, whether it's compassion or something else. I will put a phrase, and then every time I use my phone to check what time it is or see what message I've gotten, I always get the reminder, that phrase pops up. So it kind of helps me remember. Let's see where self-compassion helps with skin picking. This is like a generic way. I know this may not be identical for everyone or the same, but it was just a way of graphically representing how picking tends to unfold. So you experience a difficult emotion, you get the urge to pick, you begin picking. you experience that release, that gratification that it provides, which kind of leads you to more picking. And then at some point you have that, oh no, what have I done moment, where you see the damage or see blood or just start feeling pain. Then you stop, and then you start guilt tripping yourself because you've just picked and destroyed your face. Right? I hope at this point you can see how that's not a very compassionate thing to do. Wherever I put one of these arrows is where self-compassion can interrupt and stop the cycle. As soon as you experience difficult emotions, self-compassion can help you deal with them better. So we can stop here. If you experience the urge to pick, that in itself is a form of suffering. If you cultivate self-compassion long enough, this is where you will remember to intervene. You will remember to look for healthier ways of approaching the urge. I will give you a compassionate way of approaching the urge, I think, on the next slide. In this moment where you feel gratification and you notice that it's going to lead to that famous one more, which turns into 75 more, that's also a place where self-compassion comes into play. Because when you say one more, that is like an instance of awareness where you realize that you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing. As soon as you say just one more and then I'll stop, immediately that tells you that you're doing something you shouldn't be. When you prime your mind to think in terms of self-compassion, this is where it stops. And then, of course, guilt and shame are something that self-compassion is very good at facing just head on. Because the problem with guilt is not that we feel guilt. Guilt simply tells us that we've done something we're not supposed to do. Shame simply tells us that we've done something others don't expect us to do. The trouble is that we tend to grab and hold on to that guilt and wallow in it. And that's where suffering begins. So even though guilt is an unpleasant sensation, the suffering that comes with guilt comes from clinging to guilt. It's when we use guilt to somehow punish ourselves, which, if you remember, is the far enemy of compassion. So it's cruelty towards ourselves. And when we have that, when we incline our minds, when we prime ourselves to think in terms of reduction of suffering, then guilt becomes this moment when you pause and reflect on this entire cycle that you just went through and ask yourself, what can I learn from this so that I don't make this mistake as often in the future? So you don't make guilt any less unpleasant, but you reduce the suffering that guilt brings. And instead of just punishing yourself by holding on to guilt, you learn from it. That way, self-compassion kind of facilitates healing because it gets you to reflect on what is it that you actually do. Where else can self-compassion help? It helps with perfectionism, as I said before. It helps you with setting good boundaries. It can help you say no to your boss who wants you to work overtime, for example, or emails you or calls you after work. It's also a way to self-soothe. It's a healthy way to self-soothe. Like one of the gestures that Christine Neff talks about is putting your hand over your heart. You can try doing it now, actually, if you want. It's best to do it under your clothes so that your skin touches your skin, but I will spare you my naked chest. So you can just, even like this, it works. And just close your eyes and just focus on what it feels like. Because there's a bit of warmth that creates, like it's very easy for me to feel. And then you focus on the warmth and you can feel it slowly spreading over your body. That's a way to self-soothe using self-compassion. Another thing you can do is just like give yourself a hug, for example. Right? There are many other things, practical ways that you can introduce this. You can cover yourself with a blanket that you like. I had a client who liked putting a heavy pillow on them because that made them feel safe. Some people have, I don't know, like pajamas that they like to wear or something that provides soothing. That's also a way of introducing self-compassion in your everyday life. Self-compassion is an excellent way for people who struggle with PTSD to begin their journey of healing. especially if they want to start practicing meditation, because meditation can be tremendously helpful for PTSD, but it has to be introduced right. Uh, which is why I always insist that meditation teachers should either have some kind of therapeutic training or at least be Buddhist monks, because then they have some psychological knowledge. Because if you simply start meditating, you risk being very overwhelmed and re-traumatized. So it's helpful, but if done in the right way, it helps with depression, helps with anxiety. And one way that you can apply self-compassion, or what Tara Brach calls radical self-compassion, is called the RAIN technique. This is like a 4-step process whereby you learn how to identify and then soothe yourself when you experience something difficult. R stands for recognize, A stands for acknowledge or accept, I is for investigate, and N is for nurture. If you want instructions for this technique, just drop me an email and I will send them to you, because I have several versions of the guided. Like you can, so I guess you wouldn't call it a meditation because it's a teaching tool. So there's an audio guide that will teach you how to use RAIN. I have texts on RAIN. I've written blog posts on the topic, so I'll be happy to share all of this with you. This is a very useful technique. It's very practical. It doesn't require you to meditate, and you can use it pretty much anywhere you want. So it's quite handy to learn. I already mentioned that self-compassion can reduce guilt. And when you reduce guilt at the end of a picking episode, you're kind of removing this whole layer of triggers that you're creating. Or if not triggers, then at least this fertile ground that will spring more picking in the future. When you damage your skin, which is an act of cruelty, it's a far enemy of compassion. Dealing with the damage in a healthy way is an act of self-compassion. It's also a very good way to start nurturing a healthier relationship to your skin. So everything that you do after you stop picking, the way you take care of your skin, the way you clean your skin, the way you make sure it doesn't get infected, all that is compassionate. So that's a way to start cultivating a good relationship to your skin. Self-compassion is more likely, as I said, to make you aware of your boundaries. And this in itself, without self-compassion, isn't the most pleasant insight in the world. But when you are being self-compassionate, remember, you're not asking yourself to be perfect. So you have the capacity to accept what your limits are in this given moment in time, and then accept that and nurture yourself so that you possibly extend, but in the moment, certainly respect those boundaries, because that's what your well-being depends on. If you want to learn more about this, if you want to learn about the RAIN technique that I just briefly mentioned, this book in the middle, Radical Compassion, basically only talks about that technique. So Tara Brach has another very good book, a better one in my opinion. It's called Radical Acceptance, but this one is specifically about the RAIN technique. You will also see that she frequently uses the word trance, and sometimes it's in a way that gives a slightly different meaning to picking trances, although she doesn't write about skin picking, of course. If you want to learn about compassion overall and meditation practices, Sharon Salzberg's book, the one that I've been reading quotes from, this is my absolute favorite. For loving kindness, gratitude, for joy, for whatever kind of meditation you want, this book is really, really excellent. It's really, really good. Along with Joseph Goldstein's book called Mindfulness, I think two of the best mindfulness books written by Western authors with no competition. And then there's Self-Compassion by Christine Neff, which is also quite a good book, and it's very practical and includes a lot of worksheets and assignments to try out. So these would be very good resources. If you want audios or like blog posts, shorter texts, email me and I will prepare over the weekend. I'll prepare some resources and I will send them out to you. So that's all that I have for you. And as usual, I did it for longer than I expected to. Here's my email on the left, so you can reach out. I'm going to go through your questions now. And before I do, I'm going to see what our topic will be for next month. Let me close the polls and share the results. 1 second. They used to give me the result in like colored in red, and they don't do it anymore, so I have to scroll through everything. So skin picking and ADHD will be our topic for next month. So I'm going to stop the recording now because I've decided that sometimes when you ask personal questions and share personal details, I get messages when people saying, "Can you please like cut out the response that you gave to me, or just remove the questions that you've read." Then I've decided not to record the Q&As, at least for the foreseeable future. So I'm going to end the recording, and then we'll go to the Q&A.